But 3 years ago, when I first started working with the Adult Ed Committee, we did a survey of the congregation, and we asked for topics that people would like to hear about. And one of our members, Leslie Reindel, who's no longer with us, wrote in that she would like a session on Kierkegaard. So I would like to dedicate the session today to Leslie's memory, as we finally have come up with a session on Kierkegaard.
The term liberal is a little ambiguous when it enters into a conversation of the theological world. There is some variation between what one means liberal politically, but liberal theologically. Liberal theologically could perhaps best be summed up by, well, maybe Albert Schweitzer's The Quest of the Historical Jesus. He became critical of the many lies of Jesus that were written in the 19th century. Every New Testament scholar or theologian felt impelled to write a revised picture, offer a revised picture of Jesus. And Schweitzer pointed out that essentially everyone in their own way had produced a picture of Jesus with which they felt comfortable. That Jesus was brought into their own community and adapted nicely to the world of a burgeoning bourgeois society. Kierkegaard, of course, takes that whole business seriously at issue. He takes issue with it. Essentially, Kierkegaard has a tendency to remove comfort from the world of faith, and it becomes uncomfortable in terms of the rigor that he's committed to. For Kierkegaard, this has become increasingly clear to me more recently. For Kierkegaard, the major problem for Kierkegaard, which is a reflection of this, but he's critical of the scholarship, the New Testament scholarship, which fed the tradition in Germany essentially, but other areas in Europe as well. The acculturation of Christianity. That is the, one of the reasons he combats this with an extreme, extreme in terms of what had been accepted. He's averse to Christianity expressed in terms of a crowd, a group, a gathering. He's not very church-centered or community-centered. Everything is starkly individualistic. And that's reflected in this little image you have of sitting in a congregation listening to a message where God is the only audience, and he's listening, he's attending to how you listen to a sermon. You. Not you in a group of other people, just you. So that for Kierkegaard, there's a starkness of this sense of individual existence over against God. That carries over. Kierkegaard is often recognized as Father Martin existentialism on these kinds of accents what Heidegger says, our coming to consciousness in a world is nothing short of a stone tossed out in the middle of a lake, plop. There's no explanation for your consciousness, your existence in the world. And if you read the existential literature, It's all draws from the sense of the loss of meaning, which comes about with the rise of modern destructiveness that goes along with all the progress we know in modern life. The sense that, take Camus' myth of Sisyphus. Modern man is somewhat like Sisyphus, who rolls the rock up the mountain, and when it gets to the top, it rolls down. And Sisyphus has to do this through all eternity. Well, Camus takes that story and says, that's where we prove our humanity, that we look upon it as the necessity of facing the fact of meaninglessness and not succumbing to it, not giving up. And in the will to push the rock up the second time, third time, the fifth time, you prove your humanity, that you do not give in to meaninglessness. Your humanity is proved in your unwillingness to surrender to a meaningless world. So those themes in existentialism come to the fore in the aftermath of the 20th century crisis of meaninglessness in the aftermath of World War I, and continues through the Second World War. So it's in this sense that Kierkegaard offers makes two major contributions to the world of Christian thought in the 20th century, and more so in Europe than in the United States. The United States never suffered the destruction of World War I, and that was staggering, absolutely staggering. If you think of the casualties on the battlefield, were mass troops plunging ahead into barbed wire and new innovations, many of them developed in the United States in the Civil War. The Gatling gun becomes a sophisticated machine gun, and artillery and barbed wire, all of that business only was introduced gradually in the final stages of the Civil War. That world, and there's a mix of technology. It becomes part of this whole picture that Fitzhaber, a Nobel Prize winner, or was nominated for a Nobel Prize for the nitrogen fixation process for developing explosives. And he also innovated to help with poison gas. And so, along with all the other innovations that come with technology, there's also this haunting presence, and the scientific community has a way of sitting back often from these innovations and saying, well, we're just discovering the world and how the world works. It's the political system that has to decide these questions. So while the political system is often inept, has trouble functioning properly, reasonably. And so, well, Kierkegaard offers two things that are subtly important. The first is that the biblical God is beyond our capacity to dictate its reality, the biblical God. We are not the audience for God. It's an assertion of the transcendence of the biblical God. For your thoughts are not my thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. Isaiah. or in Corinthians, the cross is the foolishness of God that is wiser than men, and the weakness of God that is stronger than men. This suggests dimension of reality with regard to God that throw the question of integrity and honesty back upon ourselves. And Kierkegaard's very strong in this, and it was a major inspiration to certain figures, key figures in the theological resistance to National Socialism in Germany. If there was any resistance, theological resistance to Hitler, it did not come out of the previous liberal theological tradition. It came out of the rediscovery of this biblical message about God, redemption, and the need for redemption for humankind. Karl Barth wrote a book in 1916 or 18 called The Word of God and the Word of Man, setting the two in opposition. And that came out of his meetings with Tannhäuser of Kierkegaard and their shared discussions about who Kierkegaard was. See, Kierkegaard wasn't translated into German until 1903 or 4. He died in 1855. And he didn't get translated into English until the 1930s. And some of it occurred up here at the University of Minnesota with Swenson. Yeah. And only gradually, dribs and drabs, they all came gradually developed. And finally, we have a major retranslation, kind of new authorized version of Kierkegaard coming out of St. Olaf College, Howard Hung. And the Kierkegaard Library down there is perhaps the greatest source of Kierkegaard materials outside of Copenhagen itself. So, so that point, the I-thou relationship, if you hear that word, I-thou relationship vis-a-vis God, it means there's an existence that exists over against us, and it's not just a reflection of ourselves. That becomes a theme of not all, by any means, theological work that has continued after these years in World War I and II. We only have new surges of claimed competency on the part of us in the audience on all these theological questions. The other point is, and I'll make this briefly, is that Kierkegaard asserts that faith is something we all have to come to. That it's not something we can pass off. That Kierkegaard hated crowds. There may be some problems psychologically with Kierkegaard because he was such a loner, and at times he entertained some regrets. It appears that he didn't pursue his love with Regina and managed to handle that properly. Those issues are there. The faith issue is that faith is more than just an ascription to some teachings. Faith is a kind of a living relationship that you come to in your own individual life. I will say, on the other hand, that Kierkegaard has been acculturated by the existentialist movement, and so that, a lot of church people may not be strong on cocktail parties, but if you drop the name of Kierkegaard in a cocktail party, you're respectable. intellectually respectable. In fact, people will blink twice and raise their eyebrow on your own status as a thoughtful person.
And leave to get a drink.
Well, I would recommend either or also, the two volumes.
Oh, yeah, I brought either or along with you.
Okay.
Yeah, just showing. I mean, he's not an easy person to read, but he's fascinating, and in either or, you get segments of brilliance. That's part of his appeal, is that he's such a dramatic writer and has so many images that he presents. He has an image of the wild goose who settles down in a barnyard with tame goose. And the wild goose forgets how to fly. He merges himself into a group. And he also says, 10 people can get together and form an opinion. But he just scorns that kind of concealment of individual anxiety within the group. But I do have afterthoughts on some of this too. So, and some of it more recently has come to the fore as a result of a paper I read last June. Last June was the 200th anniversary of Kierkegaard's birth, and St. Olaf, the Kierkegaard Library of St. Olaf hosted a bicentennial celebration, international conference on Kierkegaard. And I had recently become involved in the thought of Luther, and wrote a book where I drew heavily upon Luther and Calvin and the Reformation period in the reshaping of the mindset of modern Christianity, break with the medieval tradition. And as a result, well, by various other avenues, I came to read carefully Luther, or Kierkegaard's critique of Luther, which becomes more and more severe in his later years, which were so short. He died in 55, so he was 42 years old when he died. But he gets involved in this attack upon Christendom, and he blames Luther for having made faith too easy for Christians. So this kind of more sharp-edged rejection. Early on, he embraced aspects of Luther thought, but then becomes increasingly critical as he attacked the church in Copenhagen. So I thought it would be interesting, since Kierkegaard stresses the idea of contemporaneity, to bring Luther back on stage to have him reply to Kierkegaard. So I delivered a paper on Kierkegaard's reply to, Luther's reply to Kierkegaard's critique. So I had to imaginally construct the presence of Luther talking to Kierkegaard, and at what points he withdrew, or would offer some correction to what Kierkegaard was saying. Of course, Barth comes to that same conclusion, that Kierkegaard is absolutely central for some aspects. If you don't read Kierkegaard as a theologian, you're not prepared to deal with the substance of Christian faith. But at the same time, you can't stay with Kierkegaard. That there's more in Christian faith than he is able to bring to the fore. And it turns out my own significant growing reservation with Kierkegaard is that in Kierkegaard there is no doctrine of atonement. And this came out in some of the other papers that were read at this conference. There's no work that Jesus completes that becomes also an aspect of faith. Of course, this is what Luther was all about. Luther's all about the possibility that you, on the basis of justification by faith, you are accepted. Your faith is, you open now to be who you are on the basis of the possibility you're not arguing with God all the time and defining God. So that's a continuing problem. I don't pretend to say that the doctrine of the atonement is easily dealt with. I mean, this idea of a blood sacrifice, all of these things, and God satisfying his own wrath by offering himself as a sacrifice that atones, those are difficult concepts to deal with. But at the same time, what increasingly strikes me as a signal statement is the idea that the cross somehow is in and of itself is a fundamental statement of what the reality of God is for life. And the absence of a body now on the cross. The kind of, whatever it is of atonement, we're free to think our thoughts. We don't have to lie or entertain lies in order to be faithful to God. There was a figure in the 19th century or in the 17th century, Francis Bacon, who was more of a theologian than people realize at times. I've argued that case. He says, we do no honor of God to God by telling a lie. But at the same time, there's this other dimension that Kierkegaard brings to the fore, is that the adequacy of our own rational competencies is not a measure of God, finally. The biblical God, in scientific terms, I've used biblical language. The biblical God is a perpetual anomaly to the world of science. Right? Reason and faith are never quite twins, the way McAllister Seal has it. Twins of heaven. There is a variance between the two.